Good day, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes until we have enough people in the room. We're just populating the room at this moment. We're all looking forward to today's presentation. For those of you just coming into the room, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here all. We have a very important topic to discuss today, and I'm really looking forward to it. Just a few more minutes. Good morning, Sergio. I see you're on screen too. All right, let's begin. So, welcome to the Online Ethics Center Spring of 2026 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. I'm Azita Hirsa, a senior lecturer in the Industrial and Systems Engineering Department at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I teach some of my favorite courses, Management of Engineering and Technology, Engineering Ethics, Ethics of Modeling, and Professional Development. I also host the Leaders in Action conversations at RPI, and I'm the past chair of the ASEE's Ethics Division and have proudly hosted the Online Ethics Center webinars since 2023. The Online Ethics Center, hosted at the University of Virginia, is a comprehensive digital repository dedicated to ethics education in engineering and science. Beyond providing valuable teaching and learning resources, the OEC cultivates a vibrant community of faculty, students, researchers, and professionals engaged in a meaningful discussion on ethical issues. Check out our website at onlineethics.org. Our webinar series explores engineering and science ethics across the interconnected domain of industry, government, and academia, the triple helix that shapes technological innovation and the ethical frameworks that guide it. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Olga Pierrakos, a nationally recognized leader in engineering education and innovation. Dr. Pierrakos, I want to spend the entire day just talking about your accomplishments and your contributions, but I'm going to make it short because I want to hear about everything that you can share with us. Dr. Pierrakos is a professor of engineering at Wake Forest University, where she served as the founding chair of the Department of Engineering from 2017 to 2022. In that role, she helped build Wake Forest's engineering program from the ground up, developing a vision for what she calls educating the whole engineer, an approach that integrates strong technical preparation with the broad perspectives of a liberal arts education. Before joining Wake Forest, Dr. Pierrakos was also a founding faculty member of the engineering program at James Madison University, and she has served as a program director at the NSF, the National Science Foundation, where she worked on national initiatives to advance undergraduate STEM education and support innovative educational models across the United States. Her scholarship spans engineering education, student motivation and identity in engineering, design thinking, and complex problem solving, as well as research in biomedical engineering and sustainable energy systems. Over the course of her career, she has mentored more than 200 students, contributed to millions of dollars in external funding research, and published extensively in both engineering research and engineering education. Dr. Pierrakos is widely recognized for her commitment to rethinking engineering education, breaking down disciplinary silos and creating learning environments that connect theory with practice while fostering innovation, inclusion, and societal impact. Today, she brings a unique perspective shaped by experiences as a researcher, educator, program builder, and the national STEM leader. After Dr. Pierrakos' talk, we will take questions. To ask a question, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box, and I'll read it to her. Audience members will not be able to use their mics or cameras. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Olga Pierrakos. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Let me share my screen. And all right. Can everybody see this? Yes. All right, great. Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here with you all and thrilled to discuss with you why engineering and engineering education is a moral practice and why character and virtues must be central to engineering decisions. The case has been made. Let me see something because I keep seeing part of my screen is covered. 1 second. One second. Trying to. Okay, I fixed it. So the case has been made that engineering is a moral practice, whether it's engineering professional societies, whether it's ethicists and philosophers, or engineering educators and engineers themselves. I'm here to sort of support that claim in my talk today. The case I want to make is that engineering education, which has received sort of less prominence in its conversation as a moral practice. And so I want to emphasize on the role that we play as educators. And I assume that most of the folks listening to the talk today are in some way connected to engineering education. So I want to focus on that engineering education is a moral practice. So let's begin to unpack that. So what is moral practice? Here's two definitions. So moral practice is the enactment of ethical reasoning in real situations, or it points to the application of using ethical principles and moral reasoning to determine what is right, what is wrong, what is obligated, and what's permissible in situations. So we see that moral practice certainly implicates ethical reasoning. What we see in engineering and engineering education is primarily three ethical lenses that are used: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. The case that many have made, including myself, is that we predominantly see deontology and consequentialism in engineering ethics and engineering education and in engineering practice. The importance is that for us to begin to understand the role that virtue ethics plays and how we must position virtue ethics as a way to educate the next generation of engineers. When we unpack these three ethical frameworks, we begin to see that moral reasoning is fundamentally seen in three different ways. Deontology guides an engineer to think about what rules or duties apply in this situation. So it's sort of what's considered a more compliance-based approach to making decisions. Consequentialism positions an engineer to think about what action will produce the best outcomes. So it's all around thinking about what are the outcomes. And virtue ethics gives us a more human lens, a more human flourishing lens, where we think about what would a good engineer, someone with sound character, do in this situation. We know that virtue ethics is the foundation of character, and the case has been made by many for how important virtue ethics is to engineering and engineering education. So let's look at an example of how these ethical lenses and how important virtue ethics is to engineering. Of course, everyone knows the 1986 NASA Challenger disaster. I know as an undergraduate engineering student, my senior year, I was introduced to this challenge. And it was how engineering ethics was taught for me as a student. What we saw in that is that it was presented as a technical failure, a failure of the O-rings that caused the combustion, they had combustion gases to escape, and for 7 astronauts to die. So it was presented as a student for me as a technical failure, but that was a missed opportunity. When I became an educator and I started digging into this important ethical disaster, I began to unpack it in a different way. And I think it's important for us to unpack it for our students in a different way. So what we saw in this situation is that managers ultimately decided to launch, but their decision-making was grounded on a deontology perspective. They were trying to figure out what rules apply and that there was nothing wrong in cold temperatures, nothing was prohibiting the launch. And so they found it to be permissible. The managers also took a consequentialism approach to making the decision. They focused heavily on what are the outcomes? What would the delay cause? What are the organizational costs for delaying the launch? And so the point here is that the decision that was made by the managers was thinking from a deontology and consequentialism perspective. What we also saw is that the engineers actually did apply a virtue ethics lens. They demonstrated courage, humility, and wisdom in voicing their concerns about the cold temperatures and the O-ring not having been tested at those cold temperatures. And so when we take a virtue ethics lens, we begin to see the role that everyone played in either displaying virtue or lacking virtue in those decisions. Even Congress acknowledged their own role in creating a culture of pressure. The point in this example is to show how we typically do not bring virtue ethics in describing these dilemmas. And yet it's so important that we do, because it gives us a different lens upon which to look at a situation. And this kind of table summarizes it. The importance here is to, the case that I'm trying to make is how important virtue ethics is as a lens and how much it's lacking in both engineering education and in our, ultimately in how we think about engineering practice. The reality is that most engineering failures are often framed as calculation errors or calculation modeling failures, as was the case in the Challenger disaster. But the reality is that they're character failures. So when pressure rises, character shows. We see these character failures as ignored warnings, poor communication across teams, production pressures, overconfidence in models, suppressed dissent, rewarding speed over safety, and even diffusion of responsibility. These are all the ways that we see kind of failures take place. I think we have a few opportunities from this example. One is that, yes, we can point to engineering failures, but we, as character failures, but we also need to emphasize and educate our students around the engineering successes and how character is needed to achieve engineering success. So I hope that that's an opportunity many of you take on to reframe engineering ethics, not just from disasters, but also successes, and to also position ethics as an everyday decision-making process that all engineers and engineering educators need to take on. And not just point to disasters, but the successes and everyday decisions that engineers make. So if we begin to dig in and better understand virtue ethics, it will give us a vehicle to also understand character development. The foundation has been laid here, even though scholars continue to lay a solid foundation of understanding virtue ethics and character. There are also many definitions of character. And whether you're a psychologist, a philosopher, an educational researcher, those definitions will vary. I'm not here to debate kind of what definition we should use, simply to advocate for how important virtues and character is to the work of engineers and engineering education. When we started doing this work at Wake Forest about a decade ago, actually more closer to 8 years ago, we also had to unpack what virtues and virtue frameworks we could use. And they're just like the definitions, there's many definitions of character. There's also various frameworks of virtues and virtue ethics. The key is to do this important work. I think there's many good frameworks out there. These days, I've used all of them, and my team has used all of them. I tend to focus a bit more right now on the little character framework, and I can say more about that later. There's also a growing body of knowledge around character education and what are effective strategies to cultivate character. Reflection is a big one. So the importance of reflection, the importance of spotlighting exemplars, the language we use and having a common language upon which to understand virtues and character is important. To understand that the systems we live in, the organizations, the structures, all of it play a role. The importance of reminders and friendships and the social networks that we live in to support it. And what I think is probably one of the most important ones is habituation. We become what we repeatedly do. And so it's very important that we practice and integrate character into everything that we do. So let's talk a little bit about this integration and what we have learned at Wake Forest Engineering in doing this work the last 8 years. So as the founding chair of engineering at Wake Forest, our mission was clear from the very beginning. This was our opportunity to reimagine and rethink engineering education. And so we started our work by envisioning the kind of engineer we wanted to create and working backwards. In this commitment and in this visioning of the kind of engineer we wanted, virtues were there. When I shared our visioning documents to philosophers, they saw virtues, and that helped solidify the direction that we would take as a program. I'm grateful that the Kern Family Foundation supported this work. They saw the importance of founding a new department, bringing in competence and character into every aspect of building the program. We worked with a great team of character education scholars representing many disciplinary traditions, from educational research to psychology, to philosophy, to religious studies, to business ethics, to leadership scholars, to assessment. This is the team that helped us along the way. This work cannot be done without the engineers and engineering educators. They were an essential member in carrying this work forward. Upon having an understanding of what virtues and character is, this is the team that carried it forward. Again, representing various perspectives and industry experience in academia and industry in helping move this work forward. I'm very proud that in the 8 years, over 20 modules have been integrated across the engineering curriculum at Wake Forest, over 14 virtues integrated, and over 15 faculty engaged in the work. This slide just shows you a glimpse of the ways that we integrated in core engineering courses and the individuals that were involved in doing this work. We also learned a lot. Our students were our partners in doing this work. We needed to understand where they were at in order to move this forward. And our students gave us great insights. We saw where virtues were being developed and how. These are some of the results that you're seeing. And by the way, in all these slides, I have QR codes so that you can also sort of go to the publication and read more, since I'm going through things in a fast pace. Some of the results that we saw in our initial few years of doing this is that, not to be surprised, engineering faculty and engineering students primarily focused on performance and intellectual virtues. That's where we see natural, authentic connection with engineering knowledge and learning in the classroom. The opportunity, though, for us became that we needed to be more intentional to integrate moral and civic virtues. And this became the focus of our work the last few years. Our students provided us insights into what experiences within the curriculum really supported their growth around each of these virtues. We saw that projects and real-world applications played a fundamental role. Connecting the dots with the current events that were happening were also very important. Open-ended problems and exercises, troubleshooting, feedback, engagement with stakeholders played a very critical role for that growth. And so we began to unpack all the ways that various virtues were supported and have continued to do this work by understanding where our students are at and where they're developing. This is an example of a course that I developed in thermal fluids engineering, where we cultivated character by integrating a mastery-based learning. Mastery-based learning is a strategy that promotes mastery in a class. It was ultimately applied in thinking about the assessment methods and how we measured the learning and how we incentivized, how we even did grading in the class. What we saw in this example is that 100% of the students found this model of learning to promote resilience, courage, and humility. What they saw is that a mastery-based learning approach allowed them to see where they were making mistakes, what they saw as failures, but using that as an opportunity to grow. They were not penalized for getting the wrong answer. In fact, they were encouraged to get the wrong answer in order for us to build on that growth. And that's the idea of mastery. And so this helped us understand the specific pedagogical structures that promote character. As we also saw, what helped us a lot is institutionalizing experiential learning across the curriculum. And that was very intentional, an intentional strategy for me as the academic leader of the unit. I supported faculty development in this space, and I'm very proud that across the curriculum, we built a program with experiential learning in every class. There's all kinds of ways to do this. And so I invite you to look at this publication in the ways that we institutionalized experiential learning, and as a result, promoted character cultivation. I think academic leaders of programs need to also see that organizational change can also be supported by thinking about virtues and character. And so in this paper, I talk about specific strategies that helped to achieve institutional experiential learning across the program. And so that's not disconnected from thinking about virtues and character. In the last few years, as we saw faculty move around the curriculum and some things getting lost, and being more intentional about moral and civic virtues, we started interviewing engineers and ultimately developing situational judgments. that are typically seen as assessment tools, but we have used them and designed them to be pedagogical approaches to cultivate character. So we bring real world situations to the classroom to cultivate all kinds of competencies, including character. This is an example of a real world situation that an engineer on our team faced, and we turned that into a situational judgment. This points to an example of how a new engineering task was given to a team with limited expertise. And we invite students to think about what would they do. In this work, we learned when we asked students at various levels and compared their responses to experts, that there's differences. We began to see that situational judgments became a promising approach to seeing these differences. And this table shows how first-year students, compared to recent graduates, compared to experts, show different approaches to responding. And we could unpack that in class. What we also did that's really important is that we mapped virtues that are embodied and virtues that are deficient in its response. And that became another vehicle of conversation around bringing virtue-based decision-making to real-world situations. We began to see patterns across experience levels. And that became an opportunity for us to add to what we now have is over 100 situational judgments that engineering faculty can select from to integrate into their class. So now we see situational judgments as a very powerful pedagogical approach to foster critical reflection, to bring real-world practice into the classroom in a complicated way, well, in a less complicated way, and to engage students in understanding virtue-driven decision-making, even without any explicit connections to just virtues. So even without virtue mapping, students can have rich conversations, and we're seeing that in the faculty who are piloting and integrating situational judgments. Hopefully, I've made the case through these examples that cultivating character alongside competence is possible. And as educators and academic leaders, we need to strive for achieving that in every aspect. I'm very proud that in the last few months, I've worked with Mary and Corey Crossan to offer a program for faculty and for academic leaders to think about bringing in character to different aspects of engineering education. Hopefully, I've also made the case that engineering education is a moral practice. And in the same way that we see engineering practice as a moral practice, we need to begin to see engineering education as a moral practice. So let's unpack that a little bit more. For those of you that have seen presentations by me before, you may have seen this slide. I talk about the challenges that exist in engineering education. And in fact, many of these challenges impact all of higher ed. We see curricula that are outdated or too rigid. We see learning that's too siloed, and in engineering primarily focuses on technical knowledge only. We see pedagogical methods that, again, promote lectures as the predominant mode of learning and are not often supporting student engagement and deep learning. We see cultures that are not as welcoming, and we see a faculty body that continues to need support and to be more equipped with knowledge and best practices to continue to advance our students. So I made this case in a recent publication about how important it is to think about the decisions we make in higher ed and in engineering education from a character lens. We need to think about the challenges that are currently facing higher ed and see how we're too siloed in our operation. How might we transform that approach with a character lens? We see that decisions are slow. We see that student representation is often limited in the ways that we make decisions for them. And so how do we engage them to be partners with us? We see biases in how curricular decisions get made, or inadequate leadership, inadequate academic leadership that fully understands how transformation happens and how evidence-based practices can really, that have been studied and can lead to impact for our students. And then we also see academic culture problems. So while society expects higher education to promote common good, I think we need to look internally and see how our own decision-making processes and models are helpful or not, and what can we improve. And looking at this from a virtue and character lens is important. So and let's unpack a little bit of that. So typically, when we think about curricular decisions in higher education, we see that the traditional approach is a faculty-owned all curricular changes and may not often involve the stakeholder groups that are implicated in those decisions. And the research and evidence is not leveraged. I certainly see this being at NSF, at the National Science Foundation, where we support investments in STEM education. We get proposals that are not connecting the dots with the evidence that we already know. And so when we think about a character-based approach, which is the approach I used in building Wake Forest engineering, it's very important that we invite all relevant stakeholders to be part of those curricular changes. And we bring in research and evidence to drive improvements for students flourishing. And so I make the case that virtues becomes a lens upon which for us to understand these differences, what we typically do and what a future version of what we could do could be. At Wake Forest Engineering, students for us were partners in the way that we built the curriculum. We brought in stakeholder groups from industry, from the rest of the university to help us understand the kind of competencies that we needed to integrate in the curriculum. And we created opportunities for that to happen. Similarly, we can look at pedagogical decisions that take place in higher ed and whether or not they fully support the students and their learning. We see traditional approaches where faculty and administrators make pedagogical decisions uninformed by research evidence and theoretical understanding. And if we were to integrate those understandings and that evidence, it would lead to better outcomes. This is, again, much of what I see at being at NSF is how important research is, STEM education research is to producing evidence-based practices for us. And yet we don't see that being institutionalized or being applied at scale. And that's what I'm trying to promote in doing this work, is that a virtue ethics and character lens allows us to see and unpack the decisions that we make from a very different perspective. We can also look at curricular structures and the flexibility that our curricula enable for our students from that lens as well. I make the case that higher ed and engineering education makes decisions from a perspective of institutional convenience rather than what is best for producing the best graduate or the best engineer. And so there's opportunity for us to rethink our curricular structures. I'll give you one example of what we did at Wake Forest Engineering to do that. Most engineering curricula that are 120 credits are predetermined for the students. At Wake Forest, we basically said 60% of the curriculum will be predetermined. We're going to give agency and flexibility for students to define their own path within engineering, and they'll get to do so within the 40% of the curriculum that they choose. And we saw powerful stories and journeys that students selected, where they brought the two classes in biomedical engineering, mechanical, electrical, and integrated knowledge in ways that traditional pathways would not have allowed. And so, again, the case that is being made is how important academic leaders and faculty, we need to rethink and revisit the decisions we make to bring a virtue lens to that. And through that virtue lens, we're also cultivating better students, but we're also cultivating character. I'm proud of the successes of Wake Forest and our students and our graduates and the team. And I'm proud that Wake Forest Engineering became the highest ranked academic program in 6 years on campus. And these are the successes that I think we need to build upon for all of us. With that, I want to end with two quotes that really speak to me and that motivated me and inspired me to do this work. And I keep coming back to this. So Shannon Valor is a philosopher we worked with in the early few years of our work. And she said one time, and that's why I have this quote, good engineers take responsibility that is not even their responsibility. Good engineers have this disposition. I really believe, and through this talk, I hope that engineers and engineering educators within higher ed take this as an opportunity to elevate character and elevate the importance of virtues within higher ed. I think, and this guides me to the next quote, which is from Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. So that now that we know better, especially in how we educate engineers, in how we need to integrate ethics and virtue ethics in our decision making, let's do better. And so engineering is a moral practice, and so is engineering education. And the responsibility falls with us, and the opportunity starts with us. And so with that, I want to say thank you, and I'm excited to take your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this awesome presentation. I have some questions that I will read to you. I just want to remind our audience, because I do see hands up as well. I just want to remind our audience that to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box, and the audience will not be able to use their mics or their cameras. So if you have any questions, please add them in the chat. Our first question, actually two questions, and I want to double check on the second one. Are character education modules at WFU available somewhere, and will you be able to share your slides with the audience?
Um, yes, some of it is, but some of it's in different formats. So our sponsor, the Current Family Foundation and Keen, we've published some of our modules on the Engineering Unleashed website. Others are in the form of publications. But what I can do, if it's helpful, is to consolidate those, which is part of our current kind of work in progress, and share more. Yes. And I can
Okay,
share
awesome.
slides as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Carolyn Chapman says, how would you differentiate a focus on virtues and character from a focus on ethics, which typically uses ethical framework approaches to evaluate decision? And the second part of that question is, if virtues and character are defined and prioritized differently by different individuals, does that matter?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the way of, once I understood better and was actually exposed to different ethical frameworks, I started to now generate engineering assignments that brought forward all those lenses. So I think it's important, and I oftentimes would give the same situation as I gave the challenging example. You can give any situation to a student and say, okay, if you were making a decision from a deontological view, what would that decision be? If you were making a decision from a consequentialist sort of perspective, what would that be? Versus what would it look like if it was from a virtue ethics ends? So I've created assignments where I've explicitly asked students, like, if these are ethical lenses, apply each one to the situation. And what do you learn from that? What do you see? How has that unpacked for you what the right decision is? Because I do believe that there's certain situations, it's a very legal decision that needs to be made and maybe has to be sort of done in a certain way. And so I think there's different lenses, but when we can look at all of them collectively, I think more collectively gives us more insight, and it gives students a toolbox upon which they can use in their engineering practice.
Excellent. Thank you so much. John Ladens asks, how do you deal with student resistance to the idea that engineering and character are connected, given a culture of technical and social dualism?
Um, yeah, really good question. Uh, I think you have to start kind of maybe I think when you face resistance, it's important to step back and find the angle that will pull students in. And in doing this work in our early years, some of us would start talking about sort of virtue and character, and it turned some students off. I remember one student saying, what is this? Feels like, Sunday school, right? And so, but others did not have that perception, right? Others authentically saw the link to talking about humility and courage, um, as a vehicle to advance professional skills. So what we saw in that is that some students got it. And maybe they got it because they faced challenges or they had done an internship and they had seen the situations we were talking about, where others resisted simply because of the words that we use to describe things. And so from that, we invite, it's important for us to understand where students are at and what language we need to use to pull them in. And so sometimes we may need to start in a very generic way and ask about challenging situations that they have faced, and then build connections to thinking about ethics, decision making, and bringing in sort of a virtue ethics and character lens. So I get that resistance can come in. But I also believe that there's strategies that we can use to motivate, engage, and pull students in understanding the importance of this. And especially when we can pull in um, practicing engineers who can do that for us, and bring in academic leaders who emphasize and promote the importance of all this. I think that can also go a long way. So hopefully you can bring in other partners and other voices to help students understand those connections in different ways.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say, and your response too, I certainly appreciated. One of the things that I deal with, we prepare our students to go to the Lockheed Martin competition. And they go, and technically they do really, really well. And at some point towards the end, they turn around and they say to me, "This is not engineering ethics, this is management ethics."
Yeah,
And so and the question is, so what's the difference? When do you cross the line? At what point does management and business decisions cross the line and become engineering ethics issues? And I love the fact that in the beginning, when I was introducing you, there was this idea of not just the dualism, the technical and the social and the business dualism, but certainly I think for us as academics, it's about crossing those silos and getting into
yeah.
crossing those boundaries and coming to a shared understanding. So thank you for that question and for the response. Joseph Carson asks, if a Wake Forest engineer experiences reprisal for mandated reporting or whistleblowing, will Wake Forest do other than bystand?
I mean, I, th- you're right that that's maybe the ultimate test if we're producing the right, if we're, are we graduating the kind of engineers we want, right? I get that. Um, we don't have we don't have those metrics. I certainly, though, as I speak and have conversations with our Wake Forest alum, I am impressed in the way that they are articulating the challenges that they see. I think the best we can do as educators is give them and equip them the best way that we can. And I do believe that equipping them with the language, the understanding, the situational sort of awareness to be able to tackle these challenges is the best that we can do. And simply hope that in practice, they can navigate that appropriately, and develop the right action plan to tackle that appropriately and ultimately become ambassadors for better organizations. Um, this is why I also have gravitated to using Mary Crossan's little character
Mhm.
framework and virtues. It is it is sort of connect, it's a professional sort of context, and because it comes from it from a business perspective, it's also practical. So you're asking a big bold question, and the best we can do is hope that our students, upon having this knowledge, can really deliver and come forward and do the right thing. And we need to look at character not only at the individual angle, but at the organizational, even team level, and begin to unpack policies, procedures that organizations have from that lens. And which is why I like the Mary Crossan's framework in being able to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, as Joseph, as you've asked that question, one of the things that comes to my mind is the systems that we are working in and the boundaries and the limitations that we have. And do we boldly make a paradigm shift at some point? At some point, what do we do? So I think there are limitations that we're dealing with. So thank you for that question and thank you for the answer. Conrad Zapanta says thank you. So thanks from that person. And Stephanie Bird says, for broader accessibility, could you please provide your references in a standard format as well as the QR code format? Um, I'll have
Yeah. I mean, the citation is at the bottom of the slides, and so once you have the slides, I think you can look up the yeah, the reference.
Great. We have two other questions. An anonymous attendee says, besides the three philosophical lenses, deontology, etc., have you found other lenses or other concepts useful in helping students see why character education is so crucial for engineers?
Um, yeah, I think if what was really here's some surprising results that we discovered that I think help answer this question. So when we were assessing and trying to gain from students where their growth was. We discovered that, even so, we had one faculty member who we recruited, being a practicing engineer, that actually wasn't an early adopter in bringing in character virtues to the classroom. And yet, students said that his stories in the classroom and how he modeled good professional practice and how he made decisions in a professional context really helped their growth. And by that, what I'm trying to point to is that um, we found an incredible amount of success with engineering faculty who could bring professional practice experiences, and from the part-time faculty that we hired who were practicing engineers. And so whether or not they use virtual language or character language, I think just real world authentic situations that point to the complexity that our students will face becomes a vehicle to begin to unpack these important, these critical decisions that need to be made. I primarily use the three philosophical lenses that are shared. I'm sure there are others, and I think that's an opportunity for all of us as a community to continue advancing those other tools and developing those other ways and sharing that with each other so that we can continue to advance engineering education.
Great. Thank you so much. Another anonymous question. Did researching and developing character and virtues over the years in engineering education change who you are as an engineer and as a whole person?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, becoming more aware and having the language to understand what is happening, I have felt over the years in my various roles more responsibility, which is why I appreciate opportunities like this to share what I know, because only through kind of sharing can we all survive. So I feel an incredible responsibility to share what I know, even when I see blind spots, and again, hope that through that becomes something more that all of us can continue to advance. So the answer is yes. Um, and the virtue that just I feel a lot is just responsibility and courage, because when I see something that others can't see, finding the right words, the right communication approaches to make that visible when I see that the intentions of others are good, but they just can't see maybe what I can. Um, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you today and hear all this knowledge that you imparted and your experiences. One last question. Our audience is very diverse. We have academics, we have government, we have industry, we have students, postdocs. What is the one thing that you want us to all know, in this diverse platform?
Yeah, I really appreciated your introduction of me as someone who kind of has attempted to break silos, and I feel like I've done that. Um, and as you saw, I put pictures of all the collaborators we've had over the years, because each one has brought such a unique perspective. And so I will just continue to promote um, collaboration with very diverse perspectives. I mean, I made the case, bring in whoever's willing to sort of work with you, philosophers, social scientists, engineers who are practicing, like just go. I would just invite you to take the initiative and just reach out, and you'd be surprised that some people will just jump on that opportunity and work with you, and together you'll make something more and better than you could have done alone. And so that has always been my approach, and I will always do that with any project that I take on. And so uh, I think higher ed is the fertile ground for such perspectives to exist, We just need to kind of make that happen more. And yeah,
Yeah, and certainly the complexity in our world and the fact that our problems around us are complex
right.
requires that we come together and work as a collective and work together to solve these issues. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, for sharing your time, and to the audience members, thank you all for being here, for asking awesome questions. So thank you for joining us. And Dr. Pierrakos, thank you for being here, the OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, and certainly the person that I depend on so much at these events, our coordinator, Tracy Marshall. So, and to all of you for joining us, and we hope to see you our next session. Thanks again, Doctor. Take good
Thank
care.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.